Find the exact value of each expression in radians. Okay, sine inverse of a number, so we are supposed to get the angle. Recall, sine inverse of a number in between -1 and 1, we get the angle back negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Tangent inverse of any real number in between negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Cosine inverse of a number that should be in between -1 and 1, we get 0 to pi. That's in the first and second quadrant. So in part A, sine inverse of 1/2. So give me an angle whose sine is 1/2. We know that sine of pi over 6, sine 30 degrees is 1/2. So this is pi over 6. And cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Cosine 90 degrees is 0. So cosine inverse of 0 is pi over 2. Cosine inverse of negative, that's in the second quadrant. If you use the unit circle, look at the angle corresponding to -1 over root 2. Or without negative, 1 over root 2, which is same as root 2 over 2, we get pi over 4. But we have negative, so second quadrant, 3 pi over 4. Okay. Cosine inverse of 3, and for cosine inverse and sine inverse, this number should not be bigger than 1, because there is no angle whose cosine or sine is bigger than 1 and less than -1, so undefined. Sine inverse of -1. We know that sine pi over 2, sine 90 degrees is 1, but there is negative. Then in fact sine inverse is an odd function. Sine inverse and tangent inverse we can pull outside, and pi over 2, because sine pi over 2 is 1. Tangent inverse is also an odd function, we can pull negative outside. And root 3, that's tangent 60 degrees is root 3. Tangent pi over 3 is root 3. So this is pi over 3. And finally, no, there are two more. Sine inverse of sine 3 pi over 4. They were supposed to cancel, provided the angle for sine inverse of anything, we should get in between negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Okay, but 3 pi over 4 is outside of this range, so we need to find the value of sine 3 pi over 4 inside. So this is same as sine inverse of sine 3 pi over 4. Just look at the unit circle, or 3 pi over 4, which is same as pi over 4, the reference angle. And sine is also positive in the second quadrant. That's same as sine pi over 4, or you can write 1 over root 2, or root 2 over 2. Okay, then sine inverse and sine cancel, because pi over 4 is in the range of negative pi over 2 to pi over 2, so pi over 4 is the answer. Or you could have figured out the value of sine 3 pi over 4, which is 1 over root 2, and sine inverse of 1 over root 2 is pi over 4. Finally, cosine inverse of cosine pi over 4. And recall, cosine inverse of anything, that should come out in between 0 and pi. But pi over 4 is bigger than pi, outside of this range. So this is not simply pi over 4. We need to work inside first. Cosine inverse of cosine pi over 4. You can find the value of cosine pi over 4 using unit circle or reference angle. Pi over 4, pi over 4. Okay, this is bigger than pi, so in the third quadrant, pi over 4, and the reference angle will be just pi over 4. And cosine in the third quadrant is negative, so negative cosine pi over 4. Or if you use unit circle, then you can find the value, x coordinate for cosine. That would be then cosine inverse from unit circle. You can skip this step, the value will be -1 over root 2. Okay, or If you go to reference angle, this is pi over 4, but third quadrant negative, cosine pi over 4, negative stays there, cosine pi over 4 is 1 over root 2. Now let's find the angle in between first or in second quadrant whose cosine is negative. All positive in the first quadrant, so obviously in the second quadrant 1 over root 2. Without negative it would be pi over 4, with negative just 3 pi over 4, pi over 4, 3 pi over 4, 5 pi over 4, and 7 pi over 4. Or if you use unit circle, look at the coordinate, okay, x coordinate in the second quadrant whose x coordinate is negative 1 over root 2, and the angle will be 3 pi over 4. Okay, final.